the topic of ecologies and futures feels as personal as it does professional. And I'd be really interested to know who else has gone through some version of what I'm going to describe. In the last few years, I've gone from a kind of abstract anxiety about the natural environment and climate change to a concrete determination to do something. I've made new commitments to my education, action, activism, even on the subject. It's affected my politics, my spending, my lifestyle, but it hasn't really affected my scholarship, or at least not yet. And that's why I've been so inspired by today's talks, because I see people early in their careers really brilliantly embedding an understanding of the fragile symbiosis between humans and nature, and thought about how do we put this into our research as classicists. And what I found is today I was hearing about subjects that all fascinated me when I was a doctoral student, good 20 years ago, but that I tended to see as fundamentally unrelated to each other, or even detached from any applied or real world significance. So when I was researching ancient prophets, or what Michele called censors, I love that, not just Cassandras, but also Pythias, Sibyls, Tiresiases, witches, I spent a lot of time thinking about voice, about representations of the non-human and post-human, more non-human than post-human actually, about the way in which gods and mortals are imagined as inhabiting the spaces of the natural world. I thought about how witches in Roman love elegy are described as making the stars bleed, turning rivers back towards their sources, drawing out ghosts from dead bodies in order to influence the future. I thought about how the voice of Virgil's Sibyl in the Aeneid echoes snippets of the future, back from the walls of the cave that she inhabits, before her writings on leaves become the institutionalized pages of the Augustan Sibylline oracles. I thought about how Lucan describes the Pythia at Delphi as a human body filled with all space and time, the whole cosmos, the past and the future. And I just wanted to read this little clip to you because I think it is relevant to what you were all talking about. All time converges into a single heap, and all the centuries oppress her unhappy breast. The chain of happenings so lengthy is revealed, and all the future struggles to the light, and the fates grapple as they seek a voice. Everything is there, the first day, the end of the world, the ocean sighs, the number of the sand. So when I was looking at these kinds of episodes, they felt both recognizable and alien in the way that ancient material so often does to us. But in no way did I really think about how this applies to our contemporary experience and our conversation about what it means to grapple with an uncertain future. So I'd just like to take a few moments to draw out how you've made me think differently today, and moved the dial forwards for us, both in terms of classical scholarship, but also in terms of how we face the world and the future responsibly. And then I want to show you, if we have time, a little bit of the kind of work that I've just started doing, in which I've tried to start thinking a little bit about this topic, although a lot of what I do will, as I say, be influenced by the things I've heard today, which have been so helpful. And I'd like to begin by framing my thoughts on why the work I heard today is so important. I was actually at a workshop a couple of days ago at King's, where a lot of us have got together to think about the value of creativity in our work, in our research. And what was really fascinating to me was to hear from the scientists in the room who were celebrating this approach. And also at King's, I should say, scientists are taken considerably more seriously than humanities scholars. So we're always really pleased when they say things that we want to hear. And one of them said, the best scientists are the ones who discover things for the first time ever, are the ones who've managed to imagine what they might see before they see it. And I thought that was really interesting, where they were talking about, this importance of being able to kind of envisage the world in which you make your scientific discoveries before you do it. But the other thing that they said is that this is becoming increasingly important as our data proliferates, as we have so much data in the world. They've reached a point where it's not about finding new things, it's actually about finding fewer things, about reducing this overwhelming mass of data into a narrative, a story that makes sense to us. Because otherwise we're just swimming in a world of AI that makes no sense. And we have to create narratives. We have to tell stories from the data that we have. So too with today's papers. I just felt like that was a really helpful way of thinking about these papers, where so much of the value lay in this creative imagining of alternative paradigms, the selection of different pathways through material that we know, the invention of new narratives. And also what I loved about all the papers taken as a collective is that they reminded us that the world is not one of boundaries and borders. It's one of continuums and transformations between past and present, human and non-human, food and effluence, local and global. All of these things are seen on a spectrum. So in the first panel, Michele and Cecilia started us off by thinking about pollution or miasma. I mean, really the kind of topics that are so urgent right now, with their measuring or visualizations or mapping of what they described as our instinctive responses, things we kind of have a feeling are in there, but we can't really prove. And I thought that their work plunged us brilliantly into thinking about the interconnectedness of human action and the environment. Ecologies, networks, bridges, all of these words that were coming out about creating those connections. And I liked how they brought out this subjectivity of measurement itself, that it is not objective, that what we measure, how we measure, which bits of data we select is all subjective. And that this happens both within characters' articulations of their relationships in the ancient material, but then also in the way that we as scholars decide which of those pieces of information we're going to take forward. And then moving into the second panel, we moved into the stage, the performance, and particularly those functions of voice, masking, and their place in collaborative performance. And Laura took us into this different way of thinking about networks and interconnectivity by conceptualizing the site of performance as an ecology itself and positioning it within what she called this living continuum, this process of evolution, and illustrating its living matrix in the body of a modern performer. And while we may not have got all of the song, I think a very swift sense of what it means to actually embody the practice that you're talking about. So exploring the many layeredness of performance, she brought to the foreground the question of embodiment, also memory, which I think is so important, every individual memory, and the affective dimension of the performing arts. Rather than the imaging that we found in the work of Michele and Cecilia, there we had the beginning of an analysis of what it means to reconstruct a particular performance, and what it means to put into contemporary performance mask and voice. And then the presentations of Nassim and Letizia gave us this new metaphor to work with, which was really interesting, the ecotone, the rich space between multiple ecologies. And I think Madeleine prompted a really fascinating deeper dive into why we might use such a metaphor, how we may want to think about human culture in terms of wider natural forces, and perhaps to untangle the dimensions of deliberate, human, and non-deliberate, natural propagation. What it means, where do these things come from? How much are we actually doing these things ourselves, and how far is nature imposing those decisions on us? And I love how Nassim wove in the notion of ventriloquism as introduced by Aristophanes to model this filtering of different influences in one single space. So like Laura, Nassim is exploring how one voice, knowledge, skill set is funneled through another's body or mask, particularly in reception or in metatextual reflections on one's position within the canon. Laura's use of the ecotone metaphor, Letizia's use of the ecotone metaphor, Letizia, allowed her to help us think about transgressed spatial boundaries in comedy as framing a productive instability between ecologies, creating a new organism, a new collective, a new agency. Again, this really empowering way of thinking through what it means to be interstitial in these different spaces. And then our final panel of papers, it kept on going, so much new amazing work, started by keeping us in that comic genre. So there were so many lovely lines running through it, but unzipped the impermeable skin of human performance. So I've stolen Alex's metaphor there. and dealt with this fragmentation of human and animal alike. So Tom took us from primarily text and performance-based analysis to these critical theories on the aesthetic and the ideological dimensions involved, and brought us to a closer understanding of this comic grotesque as a challenge, an estrangement, a defamiliarization of the classical. Alex brought us almost to the very present moment in her development of some of these ideas in her paper's conversation with Elizabeth Cook's Achilles. And I thought her vivid discussion of intercorporeality and the river Scamander's hypoxic, and I love this term as well, sort of suffocatory experience, took us to the moment that most defines our humanity, that is our existence on the brink of death, right? That's the moment where you are most human, whilst transferring that experience to the natural world. And I think a challenge was implicit here too, that is the importance of finding the subjectivity in nature. What she called ecological empathy, which I like. I mean, in some other forms, you might call it anthropomorphism. But that way of doing it in a way that doesn't reduce nature just to an allegory of human behavior, but actually thinks about it qua nature. And then Olivia traced these vibrations between human and animal further through the Dionysiac dance, music, and becoming that took place under the direction of Theodoros Tersopoulos. And I thought that panel, taken as a whole, was such a fantastic example of how we need to sustain, on the one hand, vulnerability and mourning, two words that came up, with, on the other hand, a joy and appreciation of the beauty in the world around us. So time is a little bit limited, but I would like to take my last few minutes to tell you a bit about how I've been trying to do some of this and kind of try and draw out how this works in dialogue with so much of what we've heard today and why I'm taking away what I'm taking away from these wonderful papers. Doing a little bit about why I've identified those particular things that I just described. And this is because I've been working on a creative project. It's called the Temple for Cassandra. It's mainly because we were trying to get funding from something called the Sanctuary Scheme at King's, but it's not really, I don't actually like the association of Cassandra and the temple for obvious reasons. So it's going to be called something else quite soon. But the idea is that we're trying to build, and I'll tell you who we is in a minute, an installation that animates the ancient words of Cassandra through sound and movement, exploring the way in which Cassandra's communication of prophecies about the future mirrors contemporary scientists' attempts to prophesy a future affected by climate change. And I do this because, and this is something I thought about a lot when I was writing about Cassandra, she is easily seen as a figure for despair, for missed opportunities, failure to communicate. But actually in her ancient characterization, and indeed in many modern works of reception now, she's also uniquely resourceful in her attempts to communicate. And moreover, the difficulty her interlocutors have in understanding her prophecies, particularly the way in which dramatic choruses respond to her, as if she's adopting a foreign language when she moves into the future tense, inspire them to work even harder to engage with her. So these exchanges create new connections based on sympathetic attempts to read each other's emotions, to reflect on each other's life experiences in different countries and project different fictions about the future. So Cassandra may predict an awful future, but her miscommunications offer the illusion of an escape from it, from that predestined future into an experimental alternative world. That was a kind of more wordy version of what we tried to do to sell this project, but so I gave you the sale on this slide. So I thought, in the spirit of kind of explaining the emotional resonance of this kind of work, I would tell you a little bit about how it came about. It emerged basically from friendship and solidarity between colleagues, collaborators, and creative practitioners. So it began when my colleague, Rowan Gard, who is in the King's Department of Geography, was chatting to me about her work. She's a scientist and activist who works with communities in the Pacific that have been devastated by the impacts of climate change. She worked in Fiji in the aftermath of Hurricane Winston in 2016, which killed 44 people. And earlier last year, she told me that she'd begun to lose hope in our ability to convince people in time of the need for drastic action to avert catastrophic climate change. And she sounded to me awfully like Cassandra. Meanwhile, I had been admiring the work of my colleague Priyanka Basu, who researches South Asian folk art forms, is highly trained in Indian classical dance, and has also worked with communities in Bangladesh affected by climate change. And meanwhile, I've been talking informally with Toby Young, who is a composer and professor at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, who'd already worked on immersive soundscapes focused on the retelling of ancient stories through his work with the London theatre company Punchdrunk. I'm not going to read all this, but he's actually very articulate about what it is he does when he tries to bring ancient worlds into the present. And I do quite like his idea about doing the perceptual labor of making us feel unsettled about future events. So the four of us began with a pretty relaxed process of perspective sharing, again, to bring up some of these questions about empathy and thinking across different times and spaces and approaches. So it was an exchange of ideas in which we were presenting our very different disciplinary knowledge as a way of getting to know each other and getting to know the art forms and beliefs and peoples and world spaces with which we identify. We established several themes that we wanted our project to embrace. We wanted to produce an artwork that could travel, that could occupy different spaces or temples indeed. And we wanted to reflect on the way in which Cassandra expresses herself in modes other than linguistic. We wanted an artwork that would speak to a global audience and not through one single language. That was really important. And we wanted to find, to come back to the topic that we've brought up, to find the beauty in the way that she communicates about a problematic future through image and sound. And the inspiration for the form of the project came as I introduced my colleagues to the way in which Cassandra's body is repeatedly implicated in her efforts to communicate, particularly her hands. Again, I'm not going to go through any of this material. This is entirely collated from my kind of old notes. But it really fascinates me how often Cassandra, when her words don't work, she turns to gesture, the language of gesture. So we have it in Aeschylus. Quintus Smernaeus talks about, so sometimes Clytemnestra is like, can you use your hands? She stretches out to Ajax when he is assaulting her. She's described in the Aeneid very briefly. She's silent in the Aeneid, but her hands are tied behind her back, so she can't even communicate with her hands, but she tries with her eyes instead. So we have this repeated picture of her either using her hands or being explicitly constrained. And it also struck me as quite funny that many, many years ago, I've been doing a bit of work on the French composer Berlioz, who was completely convinced that his misunderstood music was also just like Cassandra, who can't use her, you know, who's trying to raise her hands, but she can't because they're tied. So, I mean, he's a good classicist, but also massively melodramatic. But it just struck me that he had seen this episode and thought, oh yeah, this tells me something about how I'm received or not received. Anyway, so when I was talking about this, Priyanka started explaining a little bit about the body language of classical Indian dance is itself so carefully pitched as a semantic language, you know, it's a way of communicating through very specific hand movements and also eye movements, interestingly. It's very like ancient pantomime. And in fact, I've got a couple of, you know, potential pantomime areas, which is something that I need to explore a little bit more. But actually, in a way, to find a contemporary practitioner who does something that is like that, but from a very different culture and is an expert in that field was a real joy. And so this gave us our kind of fundamental concept, which is an interpretation of Cassandra in the hand movement of Indian classical dance, responding to fragments of descriptions of Cassandra from antiquity. And the idea was we'd video Priyanka's improvisations and then layer some sound over the top. And my priority for that sonic overlay was to commission translations of those verbal descriptions of Cassandra into languages from each of the inhabited continents of the world, which is a stage of the work that hasn't happened yet, but that's going to come. But Toby's priority for the soundscape was, as I mentioned on the slide earlier, to reconstruct the elements of palimpsest. So at the moment, we've just got a digital, sort of experimental digital soundtrack that tries to create that. But meanwhile, running through this whole project, and I am wrapping up, I promise, because I don't want to talk about my work all the time, Rowan kept reminding us that communities are resilient. You know, even in her despair, she said, my Fijian friends have rebuilt their lives. And even as she kind of continues to raise this global alarm, she said there is a beauty in these lives that have been rebuilt that is really special, and that says we can recover from these episodes. So that kind of combination of anxiety and how do we process this, but also trying to keep that element of hope as we run through this work that uses these ancient ideas to help us navigate the future, runs right through it. The work is not finished. It's actually barely started, but we filmed a little proof of concept. So I thought what I'd like to do is to leave you with it. It's just a couple of minutes of it to show one version of how ancient prophetic models and performing arts might help us navigate into uncertain futures, but in many ways just to give you an idea of what so many of these really fantastic papers today are going to inevitably feed back into in my work because of what I've taken away from today. And I'm so grateful to you all for sharing this. But also, you know, I hope that we can swap notes and continue to share how we do this futuring. That's a new verb I heard just 2 days ago in this workshop. So I'll just show you very briefly.